Welcome everyone to the Unlocking Vaccines Summit and Brainstorming. We're grateful to all of our great speakers and panelists who are joining us in very short notice, and we're grateful for generous support from multiple foundations and philanthropists, especially the Bakewell Foundation. We're gathering virtually today to try to advance vaccine decision-making and policy as we all continue to deal with the shocks and aftershocks of the global pandemic. We'll be featuring several great speakers and panelists over the next 4+ hours, so let's get right to it. Let's start with a status report on global vaccinations. This looks like a fair fraction of the world is vaccinated, but most areas of highest population density are lagging. So only about 10% of the world has been fully vaccinated. And experts say at the current rate, it'll take another 2 to 3 years to vaccinate about 3/4 of the population, of the world population, and millions more will die in that time. So what is the most rational path forward, not just for the next few years, but for the future, for the foreseeable future? One leading and highly contentious proposal is to suspend patent and other intellectual property rights of vaccine companies, allowing, in theory, unrestricted local production. Here are a few recent headlines addressing the issue. The Biden administration in the US recently declared support for this approach, while many other countries and vaccine producers strongly oppose this approach. Given that the pandemic is far from over and that critical decisions are being made very quickly, RaDVaC has assembled this short conference and brainstorming session to discuss possible alternatives to this proposal. In particular, RaDVaC supports and contributes to the adoption of an open source model similar to extremely successful open source models in computing and cell phone operating systems like Linux and the Linux-based Android operating system, Android. Using Android as an example, here are the relative adoption numbers for cell phones based on various proprietary, for cell phones that are based on open source and various proprietary operating systems, including Windows and Apple iOS, which is in purple, versus Android in blue. In late 2008, Android was launched as a free and open source Linux-based operating system for cell phones and mobile devices. And today, it runs the majority of the world's mobile devices. Similarly, over the past decade, free and open source Linux has become dominant in critical applications like top websites, internet servers, and global cloud infrastructure. And here's one reason why experts favor Linux. It's more secure than other operating systems. So for internet and cloud applications, Linux serves as a secure foundation for immunity to digital pathogens, and open source patches and security updates are like vaccine boosters, booster doses against emerging variants of concern. These are some of the critical issues and questions. Will this model work for human vaccines? Are vaccines too complex and expensive? Are they potentially too dangerous? Are clinical trials too complex and expensive? And are IP protected investments such as patents essential for innovation? People had similar questions about Linux and later about Android. And today we'll have several esteemed speakers and panelists address these and related issues. We'll introduce each of our speakers and panelists in a bit. We'll also have a presentation from Craig Travis of Imogen Pharmaceuticals on the benefits of nasal vaccines. And we are the RaDVaC team members who organized this conference. I'm Preston Estep, founder and chief scientist. Brian Delaney is the RaDVaC clinical trial liaison, and he'll be giving a talk shortly. Alex Hoekstra is the technical director and moderator for the conference, and RaDVaC director of communications, Ranjan Ahuja, will introduce the speakers and panelists. So that's some of the team, but what is RaDVaC? RaDVaC stands for Rapid Deployment Vaccine Collaborative. We're a group of scientists, and we believe rationalists, compelled to action by the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. RaDVaC produces and tests rapid response vaccine designs and protocols and shares them as a free and open source project. Protocols are designed for simple and robust vaccine production and nasal self-administration. RaDVaC is a 501c3 US nonprofit public charity. So RaDVaC discovered something early in the pandemic that only later became common knowledge. These are two headlines from December last year. The BioNTech Pfizer vaccine was designed in just a few hours. And Moderna's vaccine was designed in just a couple of days. So here's what we learned over a year ago. Because of decades of extensive and expensive research and development on pathogens and R&D on vaccines, modern vaccines are quick and easy for experts to make, and they have by far the highest probability of success of any therapeutic class. And so RaDVaC did what a lot of people have done throughout history. We decided to make and to take our own vaccines. But then we did something a little different. We shared everything we did without patents or intellectual property protections free on the internet. And so here are some key features of RaDVaC open source vaccines. Safe ingredients with a long history of published results in clinical trials, preclinical research trials, ease and robustness of production, intranasal delivery, and later on Dr. Craig Travis will give a presentation highlighting the advantages of nasal vaccines. The vaccine antigens are short pieces of virus proteins that are non-infectious and make the vaccine easily changed in response to variation. And just as a final note, we're interested in possibly adding mRNA vaccines to the project. So we're interested in speaking with IP lawyers. So if you're an IP lawyer and interested in that, please contact us. When we consider an alternative vaccines model, like a patent-free approach, one barrier to vaccine deployment is a general barrier to alternatives, and that is vaccine hesitancy. Not in taking vaccines, but in deploying vaccines. And this headline underscores the problem. The vaccines people are receiving now haven't changed at all in the past over a year, past 14 months. They were as safe and as effective then as they are proving to be now, yet they weren't widely deployed for nearly a year while the pandemic did enormous damage. And the question is why? Why did we wait so long to deploy them? Most people think vaccines are very serious medicine and very dangerous. Public health officials often claim we need to protect public trust from vaccine disasters of the past. They often mention two frightening missteps: the Cutter incident and a vaccine for respiratory syncytial virus, RSV. And more recently, problematic vaccines have been Dengvaxi and Pandemrix for influenza. And the Cutter vaccine was an insufficiently inactivated whole virus, which caused polio. 169 people were paralyzed and 10 people died. Later on, there was a formalin inactivated RSV vaccine. It was the first vaccine to cause a proven case of vaccine-enhanced disease, which is serious disease and hospitalization. And then Dengvaxi caused some serious problems, as did Pandemrix. But overall, these serious incidents happened over 50 years ago with vaccine designs that are no longer used. And the grand total number of deaths in all these trials was 12 people. This is the historical low historical low point for vaccine safety that people, public health officials often cite, 12 deaths. Well, in January, SARS-CoV-2 did more damage than all of these vaccines combined every 5 minutes in the US and about every minute worldwide. So RaDVaC's perspective is that this is clearly an asymmetric assessment of risk, vastly underestimating the proven very high risk of the SARS-CoV-2 virus and other pathogens, and underestimating the typically very low risk of vaccines. In other words, vaccine deployment has been extremely unrealistic. And that is a more general problem for considering alternative models and for access to vaccine. And the proof of that unrealism couldn't be more striking and more clear. RaDVaC clinical trials liaison, Brian Delaney, will show you some data and headlines showing the degree of asymmetry, but it's extremely large, shown by the 100 people here on the left of the screen harmed and killed by the virus versus maybe one harmed by vaccination. Although multiply the virus harm by maybe 100, and this 10,000 to 1 ratio is probably closer to accurate. Now, many people have said this is a real world demonstration of the famous trolley problem. And again, Brian Delaney will present that problem in greater detail, but briefly, a runaway trolley is heading down a track where 5 people are standing. If you don't switch the tracks, you're standing at the switch. And if you don't switch the tracks, the trolley will probably hit and kill all 5 people. But there's one person standing on the other track. And if you switch the tracks, then your action will probably cause the trolley to hit and kill that person. Your inaction is likely to do far more harm than your action. But if you take action, you will have to take direct responsibility for whatever harm is done. And with the vaccine trolley problem, there isn't one person at the switch. There's a diffuse lack of direct control, including regulatory bodies like the FDA, vaccine companies, public opinion, politicians, and so on. And there has to be a consensus on pulling the switch to approve and deploy vaccines. Another serious problem and the primary bottleneck for vaccine availability is the complexity and high cost of typical clinical trials. Here's a timeline of a typical placebo-controlled randomized clinical trial. And every aspect of that process was accelerated during 2020 in the race to develop vaccines. We have overlapping phases of the trials. And nevertheless, there remained clear bottlenecks in the process. For example, trial recruitment for tens of thousands of participants took months, and assessment of vaccines took additional months because of the placebo-controlled trial design. So these were serious bottlenecks that caused very serious and harmful delays in the process. And these trials typically cost hundreds of millions of US dollars. This is the main hurdle to smaller companies and even countries producing their own vaccines. So the question is there a better alternative that would be an ideal combination together with open source vaccines? Challenge trials are tests of vaccines in which a vaccinated person is intentionally infected with the pathogen to test the vaccine effectiveness. But the use of challenge trial presents yet another trolley problem, a different flavor of trolley problem. Opponents of this flavor of trolley problem, of the challenge trial, often portray challenge trials like this, with little or no mention of the costs of inaction, almost invisibility of the people who will be hit by the trolley passively. They excuse the harm done by a pathogen by saying things like, it's very unfortunate, but that's life. Whereas direct cause by the challenge is regarded as more serious. So here are some key issues for consideration and discussion by our panelists. We'll raise these issues again prior to the afternoon panel to prime the discussion for panelists who haven't yet arrived. Vaccines are safe and have a very high success rate. Decades of research makes many vaccines easy to design, makes vaccines easy to produce. Certain vaccine types, like nasal vaccines, are greatly underused. Vaccine design and production don't limit local replication of vaccine production, but patents and clinical trial costs are the main barriers. Risk aversion and asymmetries pervade decisions on vaccine trials, regulatory approvals, and deployments. And we want to consider very seriously and deeply, are challenge trials a superior alternative to typical current placebo-controlled trials? Okay, so now I'm going to discontinue the screen share, and we'll introduce our first speaker and panelist. Thank you.